Savinaka, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of Pride Month by the US Embassy Youth Council in partnership with the US Embassy. And welcome. Thank you for joining us, those of us who will be listening into this recording later on the US Embassy social media channel. I hope that this conversation is informative, allows you to ask questions, and maybe part of the movement of the LGBT that we'll be talking about later. So as you are aware, this is Pride Month, and the US Embassy Youth Council, one of the initiatives that we decided that I'm a member of actually, was that maybe because of COVID, webinars would be a good way to continue and have this conversation about the LGBT community in Fiji and the Pacific. So this is webinar 1 of 4. We'll be having 3 more in the coming weeks, 1 per week, where we will have a host of panelists or individual speakers from the region, the countries that the US Embassy in Suva is accredited to. We'll be talking about the challenges, the successes, the struggles of the movement, the organizations and individuals who are working within the movement, talking to them, talking about the allies that they have, the support that is there, the support that they need from us. So yeah, that's basically the objective of this webinars. To start off, if you have at any point any questions for our panelists are Krishneer, Rhonda, and Maria, and we'll go into the introduction later. Please feel free to send it over to us in the chat, or you could also ask these questions yourself by using the raise your hand option, and we'll allow you to pose your question, your comments, your feedback to the panelists. Do not be worried, we are recording, but this is also a safe space. We have a format where we will have Becca from the US Embassy, who will give a welcome address on behalf of the embassy, and then we'll move on to about maybe 30 to 40 minutes a few questions from myself that we have collected from the council or from the panelists themselves, where we feel the conversation really needs to happen, along with anybody who's on the call who wants to have a Q&A session afterwards. We want to keep this call between an hour to maximum hour and a half. We don't want to prolong it too much. It's Sunday evening, but let's see how this goes. So to start off, I'm going to ask Becca if she could give the welcome address on behalf of the US Embassy. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and happy Pride Month. I am very excited to be joining you this evening, and I want to welcome everyone who's participating from the Embassy Youth Council, as well as anyone else who's participating. We're very grateful for Rhonda Dina, Maria, Nailevu, and Krishneer Sen for being our special panelists this evening. And I would like to thank Abdul Shahid for moderating this session. The United States Embassy has long been an ally for the LGBTQI communities in the Pacific, and have hosted a number of events, films, trainings, discussions, reports, and I encourage you to come by. The Pride flag is hanging from our embassy for the rest of the month, so we encourage you to come by, and we'll be also putting it on our social media pages. This evening's segment, we're excited to join the LGBTQI community in celebrating Pride Month by hosting our very first Young People's Talanoa on Pride Month and the LGBTQI communities in our 5 accredited countries. Pride Month is celebrated each year in the United States in the month of June to honor the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan. However, there have been movements around the world before and after that to celebrate, to commemorate this human right, this month of human rights. The Stonewall Uprising is a modern gay liberation movement in the United States, which paved the way for activism and legislation in our country. Pride began as a protest on June 28, 1969, when the LGBTI community decided they had enough of police raids of gay establishments in New York and decided to fight back, sparking a new era of resistance that had turned into a celebration with public parades, concerts, and many fun gatherings. The Pride flag was also popularized as a symbol of the community in San Francisco by artist Gilbert Baker in 1978, representing diversity. The different colors represent life, healing, sunlight, nature, magic and art, serenity and spirit. Pride Month is also a time to remember the LGBTQI members of the community that have been lost due to hate crimes, healthcare challenges, HIV/AIDS, and other challenges. Also, self-harm, etc. Last month, we learned of the sudden and devastating death of Polly Kefu, the late president of the Tonga Ladies Association. Polly was one of Tonga's young leaders in humanitarian community works and an LGBTQI activist that has contributed so much to the movement in the Pacific. So we should remember the great work and activism of those that have come before us. This year, the United States Embassy has supported BIMBA, an organization in Kiribati, to digitalize advocacy and awareness tools for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression sensitization in Kiribati. The embassy has also supported other programs in the LGBTQI organizations, such as the Tonga Ladies Association, with developing a framework for legislation and reforms through national consultations with national decision makers to address laws that suppress LGBTQI awareness and outreach programs in Tonga. We support the USP Counseling Center, support USP collaboration with LGBTQI organizations and allies to facilitate community education. And we also hosted a pair of filmmakers to come to Fiji in late 2018 to share their film about the Tonga Ladies. We've worked with our political section that focuses on human rights, on reporting and investigating what like challenges, and so the public diplomacy section works very well with our political section to promote LGBTQI human rights. In tonight's session, I hope we'll spark conversations among you about ongoing challenges created by the pandemic, as well as success stories of the Pacific way of celebrating LGBTQI communities. This session will hopefully help us better understand how to become allies and support each other. I'd like to thank our guest speakers for tonight, as well as our Youth Council for organizing this Talanoa session. I look forward to also on our social media page this month, we will be highlighting different organizations, the great services they're providing, and the wonderful work they're doing to promote LGBTQI rights, services, advocacy. So please check out our social media and go by the embassy to see our flag flying. All right, turning the time over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca, and thank you for that brief overview of the work that the US Embassy has done, and that gives us an opportunity to see where there are other opportunities for the movement, for the activists to dip into and continue the work that is being done. I'm going to go straight into this bit of Talanoa, I would like to call it, and I hope it functions like that. I've got the introduction of our guests, but I was thinking that maybe a good way to start would be if I could ask the guests to introduce themselves and maybe highlight the work that they are doing, so that we would know what kind of questions or feedbacks we would be able to pose to the guests. So how about, based on how my screen is, I ask Krishneer if he could go first with his introduction. Tale, you might have to unmute.
Yes, the listener, you can unmute yourself.
Okay.
Right. I'm sorry, who's
you muted again, the listener.
Okay.
Right.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Krishneer Sen. I'm originally from Singapore. I was born deaf, so I communicate using my native language, which is sign language. As you kids, I've graduated with a master's in human rights at the University of in London. I also graduated with, hang on. I'm also a graduate from Gallaudet University in Washington, DC, and I've also hold a information technology certificate from a university in New Zealand. I'm also the founding member and director of the Deaf Consultancy Pacific. I'm also a Pride Hub leader with the Rainbow Pride Foundation with young people with disabilities, advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities, including especially for those within the deaf community. So I've been doing this kind of work for over 10 years, politically, socially, trying to ensure that it's an even playing field for everyone, very inclusive, especially for young people living with disabilities who are also within the Rainbow Pride movement and part of the LGBT community. So I've been involved in this kind of work for over 10 years. Also linked up with a lot of the international bodies, trying to eliminate violence against women and LGBT members in society. So linking to my advocacy work, I'm also I work very closely with the deaf community in creating awareness, especially with stakeholders, with relevant stakeholders, creating awareness on disability issues and also the rights of persons with disabilities. Also ensuring the inclusive, that it's also inclusive of persons with disabilities in terms of the LGBT and the SOGIs. I've also been part of the some of the trips to Wellington where we organized a way which was to do with LGBT and the human rights. I've also brought back a lot of experience and resources on that to share with the community, which was ILGA. So that's all I'd like to share with you, just a brief introduction on myself. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I got cut off a little bit, but thank you, Krishneer, for your introduction. Do we have a interpreter? Yes. So thank you, Krishneer, for the introduction. I wanted to, before I move on to the next speakers, I wanted to ask, you have mentioned the intersectionality between the LGBT movement and people living with disability. And I've had conversations with you previously where you have said that, you know, there's a bit of marginalization or the lack of inclusivity of even within the LGBT movement of people of, you know, living with disability. How are you able to navigate around these issues when you are invited to spaces? For example, now, how do you ensure the highlighting the difficulties or the different difficulties that people living with disability face?
So some of the challenges for persons with disabilities being included in spaces such as this is basically society doesn't accept a lot of people. They're saying, they're already persons with disabilities, and then they're trying to, so it's just not recognized. We're not recognized as having both. Also, because of the decision-making process, they're always forgetting to include persons with disabilities in these spaces. So even with the COVID restrictions and the things like distribution of food rations, the masks, the COVID restrictions that's currently in place, they often put a lot of information and there's a lot of awareness that's out there, but then there's some groups that just still don't understand the information that's coming through. So it's really simple. We'd like to have it in very simple language or simple formats that's easily understood for persons with disabilities. Also, in terms of reasonable accommodation and accessibility, these are two things that I'd like to really, for example, when a deaf person would like to be involved in the rainbow LGBT movement, oftentimes we're always told that, oh, we don't have the budget to pay for an interpreter or to provide reasonable accommodation for a person with disability. That's some examples as to why we're often left out, because there's not, the budget is not inclusive. In a lot of instances, the lack of the support in terms of communication for us to be able to understand and fully access the information that that's available to us in those spaces. Also here in Fiji, we have ratified the United Nations Convention on Persons with Disabilities back in 2017, which has already been ratified and signed. So it's recognized. So the government of the day recognizes and has included disability in the Constitution, and have amended laws to incorporate a lot of the work to involve persons with disabilities. So one thing I'd like to highlight is basically the attitudinal barriers that people have towards persons with disabilities, especially in terms of when they talk about, when they discuss topics like dating and sex and self-care. They don't see us as as a normal human being or as equal as everybody else. They sort of see us, but then we'd like to be recognized and seen and treated just like anyone, any other person within the community, within society. So it's not to be seen, or a lot of times we're often seen as a sickness or a disability or a disease. We're often marginalized and pushed aside. So I think in order to solve this solution, so I'd also like to acknowledge RBF, Rainbow Pride Foundation, for being very inclusive and having created a space for us where we can actually come in and feel very proud to be ourselves. We're not discriminated. We felt that we feel like we're part of an organization that actually recognizes us as persons with disabilities and also having a diverse gender needs. And so we've been able to work with Rainbow Pride Foundation in terms of providing hand sanitizers and personal protective equipment to members of the disabled community and also the deaf community. So yeah, that's one thing, a few things I'd like to advocate on while I'm on this platform.
Thank you so much, Krishneer. There's so many takeaways from there, and I've noted a few questions down, which we will touch on in the coming minutes. I'm going to move on to Rhonda. Rhonda, the same question. Maybe you could introduce yourself, and then I would ask follow-up questions from there. Rhonda? Oh, she needs to be unmuted.
Okay, thank you. I am so sorry about the constant muting. Like I mentioned earlier in the chat, I have noisy neighbors, so I'm reacting every time I hear something. My mouse is scrolling to mute. So sorry about that. But just a little bit about myself. By the way, Krishneer, I'm so proud of you. It's been so inspiring just to be working with people like Krishneer. I've shared a lot of spaces with Krishneer as well in the Rainbow Pride Foundation. So good job there, Krishneer. A little bit about myself. I serve on a few bodies, one of which the ILGA Oceania board. I sit on that board with Maria, who's also here on the panel. Other than that, locally, I work with Rainbow Pride Foundation as its Human Resource Committee Chair. Other than that, there's ILGA World. There's a lot of things that we're doing just to make sure that things are better for people who are coming after us. But one of the proudest hats I do wear is that I am a house mother. I belong to this family of very talented people that we call ourselves the Court Supremes. We all are house mothers and we parent young LGBT people. I myself have 9 children under my care. Most of them have become parents and spouses, 2 of which have now children. So you can say I'm a nana in some senses. But that is one of the proudest hats that I have today. Other than that, I'm a human resource professional. I also dabble in learning and development. I currently work in telecommunications. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Rhonda. And my interaction with Rhonda is mostly on social media. And I wanted to touch on something, Rhonda. I think at the beginning of Pride Month, you had talked about, because you're a trans woman, you identify yourself as a woman, there was a little bit of hate that was directed towards you on an app which, works anonymously. And I was wondering if you could give us a insight on how, because it seems like it's a constant, isn't it? You face this problem every time. How do you walk around that kind of environment, like the pressure that puts on you as an individual, as a being, the bodily autonomy that is constantly being taken away from you, not being allowed to own your body? How do you deal with that?
How do I maneuver that? How does one survive it? It's for me, I find it so disorienting that it's normal for people to diminish another individual. But for me personally, I always choose never to respond. This is only in the cases where I don't have the. But if I am publicly bullied on social media, I feel a sense of responsibility to respond for the sake of informing those who are unfortunate audiences to this bullying that happens. So I get attacked all the time. The reality of social media platforms and the advocacy on it, we get very little attention every time we're talking about pride, or when we're talking about people who are different, people who are just like me, people who are just like Maria and Krishneer. In those spaces, it's just a constant wave of advocacy that continues to go out. Otherwise, for me, when I don't have an audience, I don't feel the need to respond. But there's always a sense of responsibility innately for me to help inform and clarify things when it's on social media. You don't see me cowling in the corner in the dark and letting people like that bulldoze and walk all over me. But I think it's very important that for anybody who chooses to do that, it's good to understand yourself, know your authenticity, be proud of who you are, stand up tall, do not allow somebody else to diminish your value, your true value, because nobody can take that reality away from you. And that's the only way you can take chances and probably return a little swing here and there. I hope that answers your question, Abdul.
It does, and there's such a strong message there, and we'll come back to that also. Now, I'm going to ask Maria if she could introduce herself. Maria sent me her introduction, is very nice, and I felt like we've done the only justice who can do that introduction is you yourself. So please.
Thank you. Bulavinaka, namaste, and greetings, everyone. My name is Maria Nailevu, and I identify as a lesbian. I come from rural and remote background. I was born and raised in Taviuni. And in 2015, I just would like to quickly share that I joined Div for Equality, not as an academic, but as an activist, because I was driven by passion to work in the area of gender justice based on the experience and live realities that I went through when I was young. I was very fortunate to work for DIVA because I may say that it was a radical feminist and women-led collective that perhaps is the only organization that works for LGBT, lesbian, bisexual, transmasculine, and other gender non-conforming people, not only here in Fiji, but also in the Pacific. And because of the intersectional and interlinkage approach that we use, I may say that I was very fortunate to work very closely with marginalized groups and women, especially women from rural, remote, urban, poor, and maritime communities. In 2017, I did my postgrad in certificate in gender studies, just to help me better understand the work, especially towards moving gender work, not only in Pacific, but also in the region. I'm still actively involved in the area of climate justice advocacy, an area that I still have a lot of passion on. And also I feel that they still need a lot of work in terms of activism and advocacy. And I'm still part of the Pacific Climate Justice Urgent Hub, both online and offline. And I may say that last year I joined the ILGA Oceania board as the women's rep for the Oceania groups of small island countries. And I am now in terms of, and most of this work I do as on volunteerism. In terms of my paid work, I'm now with SIP, which is a community-based organization. My work is mostly focused in the area of development, especially extractive and mining. And apart from one of the primary objective of my work is to ensure that we are contextualizing programs and projects that are reflecting gender and human rights to our communities and ensuring that they are having a better understanding of development, especially the social impact. And also I work very closely within policy spaces. And one of the focus is in the area of legislative framework, just to ensure that it's working not only for our communities, that also the developers are aligning and are complying to this legislative framework, and also ensuring as well that our state are not just implementing it, but also ensuring that they are monitoring and ensure that they are serving the best interests of the communities there. So yeah, I think that's just in a nutshell, but thank you. I acknowledge this platform to be able to share our experiences and as well as our strategies for the youth. Vinaka.
Thank you, Maria. One of the things that I picked up, and I know of Maria, but I don't think I've met Maria in person before. Maybe I've seen you at a few conferences and meets of young people activists and things like that. So one of the things that you mentioned is that you come from a rural background, your upbringing, and then you have had experience working with women at grassroots communities level. And one of the questions, I suppose, is how do you see maybe the difference in your experience as you grew up with your identities to what young women now face in your advocacy work? Is there any change? Is it the same? What rooms for improvement do you see?
Thank you. Thank you, Abdul, for that question. Yes, I may say that I always take a lot of pride to talk about that I come from a rural and remote background, and that as much as it's a pride, it's also an area of strength, especially in activism work. And the fact that I grew up and I saw a lot of realities and lived experience of not just women, but also communities around the lack of awareness and access to information, especially not just human rights, but also gender justice. I grew up not even knowing what human rights is and gender justice, including my mom, our relatives, and I think almost all the women in Taviuni had no clue what human rights and gender justice and gender equality is all about. So when I move into this set of work, I feel that it's very critical when you come from lived experience, because that really does make a lot of difference in your work. You are driven, especially by passion, and you have a very special connection to the set of work because you know what the women and the communities are experiencing on the ground, and you don't just support and link their experiences, but also can contribute to the strategies that we know that can work for communities and that they can also take ownership of and ensure that there's sustainability on the ground. And perhaps that is a wonderful area to work in, but also from my personal opinion, is also an area of challenge, and that has been a continuous challenge as well. There has been lack of priorities in terms of dissemination and decentralizing not only support, but information dissemination to grassroots and communities. And I guess this is one of the areas that not just the LGBT communities should be looking at, but also the feminist and social movement. Because if we truly want to ensure that our processes and actions and policies are inclusive, we also need to ensure that we bring into the table, especially in key decision-making spaces, diverse voices and direct voices that are living the realities on the ground. And I think this is a very, very important discussion that we need to unpack more. Again, the conversation around class and privilege, that has always been an issue as well. And it also affects our access to resources and support. So that's why I feel strongly that there should be continuous, and if it's not happening, that we should start prioritizing the inclusion of marginalized and direct voices, especially in grassroots communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you all three for that first set of questions, because that really opens up room for so much more. I want to continue with where Maria left off in terms of development, because the LGBT movement and our topic today is looking at the success and the challenges of LGBT movements, the start and where LGBT movements and organizations are at right now, and also a bit of the cultural aspect of the LGBT movements that have existed before colonization, and we'll come to that in a while. But how important is it? And I have been in the CSO side of things for a short while, so I'll say that this is a question that has come up frequently. How important is it for development partners, for example, to really come to the table, and how can they contribute to ensuring that development happens in a sustainable and impactful manner and is not a tick in the box? Because, as I said, we are going to talk about LGBT organizations and how they function, and it functions a lot on partnership from development partners. So I was wondering if the three of you could speak on that. I will start with Rhonda. Rhonda, would you like to respond to this?
Thank you. I really like what Maria talked about, and what, of course, Krishneer alluded to earlier as well, about creating spaces for participation of diverse people. And I've always been a huge advocate for active participation in any spaces. And these spaces need to be created for us by people who are in the system. When I say system, CIS, in the system, because these are the only ways that we can probably move ahead, knowing that there are allies that siphon in funding, that create spaces for conversation, because our people need to see us visibly active, whether it be through just oral participation or even just active participation in those different spaces. People need to see us present in order for them to actually take us seriously. And this is in the form of every sort of support that's available to assist people. A classic example is, for example, in political spaces, I was earlier involved in a specific party that is involved in opposition right now. A few years back in the campaign journey, and this party, I'll just say it, it's SADALPA, and this was one party that was predominantly very traditional, quite rigid, you can call it. But because someone like myself who is passionate about indigeneity and trans women who are also indigenous, these things are not mutually exclusive. We are all that. So I started participating and also in the manifesto reform of that party, where they finally accepted leadership over all people in whatever forms we come in. And this was something new. They lost most of their candidates. And this was only possible when the leader of the party then, Rotemumu, finally saw value in our participation in those spaces. It is not, it's always perceived for us not to be safe, to be participating in spaces that are predominantly heteronormative. But because we were constantly invading those spaces, fighting for the fact that we are indigenous people as well, who are also LGBT, who are also disabled, who are also feminine, queer feminism in different forms, that allowed for change. And if that can also be adapted in different spaces, that'll be wonderful. That's for me, at least.
Thank you, Rhonda. Krishneer, again, I apologize if I keep on highlighting the fact that there is an intersectionality that you possess, with your as a person within the LGBT community and a person living with disability. How do you think that this intersectionality can work with development partners to ensure that there is an inclusivity in the development priorities that are being carried out in the region?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, moderator, for that question. So I totally agree with what Rhonda just said. And for that intersectionality issues, I think people do not really understand what intersectionality means. It's overlapping. It overlaps, and there are different examples. For instance, let me talk about this. I am gay. I am an Indo-Fijian, and then again, I have my sexual orientation. So there are multiple layers there, and it creates more barriers for me to be involved in these specific groups. So working with development partners and stakeholders, I think it's extremely important that they understand, or they dissect, or they unpack and know and understand well the specific disability and the specific needs. We that saying one shoe fits all does not work for us. So we have our diverse needs, diverse disabilities. So it's extremely important that policies are changed. So it also there needs to be more disability awareness in these spaces, and there needs to be a twin track approach for development partners as well as our groups, so we understand each other well. In Parliament, you see the Eleonora, a member of Parliament, the Eleonora. She works well with the disability community, and she's one that we see who is creating a voice out there for us. So I think it is important, that we find a way to work together and to, and it is possible that we can work and partner with people high in government, in society. And it's also important that, understanding of each other and the different organizations, the DPOs, disabled people organizations, and to encourage them to be involved and in more spaces like these, create safe spaces so they're able to voice out the issues and concerns and stories. Because if we are cocooned together, I don't think it will work. We need to hear the diverse and the individual voices. And, this is another thing that holds us back is the church, religion, our families. So there's a strong drawback there, but there needs to be an understanding of the different layers and the different, this is just something that people see from the top, but there are things that's extremely important that they need to discover. I think that's about all that I have to share.
Thank you, Krishneer. Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Rhonda.
That's a great point that was pointed out by Krishneer right there, because I think one of the biggest things that we also need to start evolving and changing is the lens of philanthropy and how we look at philanthropy, where funding is available to assist movements like ours. I say this because there's funding that does exist, but they're stretched amongst the different organizations, the different key areas that we look after. If there is a system in place where we're not token advocacy points of work, if there can be a constant flow of budget support that comes into this movement, the work that we can do with that availability of funding can be so vast. And that includes awareness, provision of information. Information is power. A lot of people who are out there not understanding the movement and our involvement and who we actually are, don't understand it because of the lack of information. We need to create this information. Children need to start growing up and seeing examples of themselves as adults and things to aspire towards. We don't have any evidence of people growing up in print work. For example, they don't read about LGBT people in books that are available for children, so they know that being who they are and what they can become is okay, it's normal, even though some of society says it's not. But the lens of philanthropy and how we actually support the movement, it needs to evolve.
Abdul, if I may just contribute very quickly.
Sorry, yeah. Go ahead, Maria.
Yes, just to contribute very quickly and just adding on from my colleagues. I guess we acknowledge the work, the great work of the development partners that have been working and have been paved over the years. But maybe I just would like to quickly share some of the challenges that we encounter in terms of development partners' contribution. Perhaps I think there needs to be a recognition that I guess in Fiji for LGBT people, over the years, we have always been working under volunteerism. And I feel that given our socio-economic backgrounds, most of the LGBT people are already living below and at poverty line. I feel that if there is a consideration around programming, if there can be allocation of funds for volunteer work, so that this can also ensure that LGBT people are also able to look after themselves, not just socially, but also economically. I guess also the other point I wish to raise and share quickly as well is perhaps I think over the years as well, we know that there has been a very less work and research that are done by Pacific people, Fijian people, and especially the LGBT people. And acknowledging Diva for Equality in 2019, they launched their first ever LBT a research report that was written by and for LGBT people. And this is one area I hope the development partners can also start to shift towards in terms of supporting research work that can be done by LGBT people. This is to avoid the misappropriation and also misrepresentation of LGBT people, and also around the issue on the doing no harm principle. And I guess this has been happening over the years, where a lot of external researchers have been coming in, extracting and mining our informations And this really put a lot of harm, and it's very dangerous to the LGBTQI movement. And I hope this can be some work that we hope that the development partners and agencies can start looking into, and also ensuring that the finding criteria, especially now when we are facing climate crisis, as well as COVID, these crises are here to stay, and that's for sure. And I hope that, the criteria have some flexibility to accommodate these issues that we have, and ensuring that there is room for negotiation for LGBT movement, and just to ensure that the work continues. And these are also accommodated in terms of our context. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And I saw Rhonda and Krishneer giving signs of yes and clapping and hands up, I think, in agreement with you. And one of the things that came out from the speakers was the need for young, kids, younger people to be able to identify themselves in this information age, in the kind of media, art, creative arts that's put out there. So I want to backtrack a little bit, and in line with the objective, I want to look at the cultural aspect of the existence of the LGBT community within the region. And I'm talking about pre-colonization, because it becomes very important to know this history in the process of decolonization, to understand why certain groups of people are as they are being treated right now. And I know that I've heard a lot about this from Rhonda, so I do want to start with Rhonda again on this one. And if Rhonda would love to, I would love to hear Rhonda, explain a little bit on the cultural side of the existence of the community before colonization and how things change. And maybe if Krishneer and Maria would like to add on after that. So Rhonda?
Sure. Yeah, Abdul, you've noticed quite a few of my tweets on this aspect. So I am very passionate about getting people to understand that being Indigenous and being gay are not mutually exclusive. And I say that over and over again. I've also talked about how LGBT people may have been perceived pre-colonial times just by looking at the current situation that we live in. Culture and religion have overlapped, and it seems like religion has, of course, homogenized the perspective on LGBT people, even in the cultural context. The stereotypes that exist in religious spaces have now come into cultural spaces, and you have people saying that this is actually a cultural expectation, that people are supposed to be acting a certain way, or looking a certain part, or looking like a certain form. And LGBT people have been expelled from that perspective. But I strongly believe that we as communal people, we as cultured people in the Pacific, and I don't think that this is unique only to Fiji, this is across the world. Any nation with some sort of culture, we don't cut off a fully functional hand. We are that hand. We have in village settings, when we know that houses are arranged according to hierarchy, and we also know that the setting has purpose. And you will never see that there is an existence or historical evidence of LGBT people being expelled from community spaces like villages just because of who they choose to be. In this day, we still see people, LGBT people, participate in those traditional spaces, continue to play in the roles that they are known for in the village settings without problem. And it's always when religion becomes part of a conversation where we start conditioning the participation of LGBT people in those spaces.
And I just stopped the video.
Maria, I can hear you.
Sorry, Maria's still on. Yeah, go ahead, Rhonda.
Yeah, so if we look at it, if we take the time to do the necessary research and due process to why we are a member of a functional system, for example, the chiefly system and the traditional system, we would not expel LGBT people from the spaces, only because we are contributors. We are enablers to the function that completes things in the village spaces. This comes in the Soliva Koro. You will not see that there's anything historically here that exists that says LGBT people can't participate in these spaces. And that's because that's who we are as a people. That's how we are. If I can share a story about my own narrative on this, I've grown up being the only son to two elderly parents, both of which came from two chiefly families, one from Kandavu, one from Lao. And I have always been limited to not participating in these spaces because when religion, like I mentioned earlier, comes into the conversation, but when it then comes to my traditional obligation to participate and contribute financially, or the provision of artifacts like mats, tambua, and stuff like that, it seems okay. It's fine because Rhonda brings this to the table. If that's our perspective, we should then accept the fact that LGBT people are active participants in traditional spaces, and we don't cut them off just because of who they are. There's no historical evidence. If we do the research, there's no historical evidence of an LGBT person being exiled. Usually people who are exiled, Abdul, are known to live in the fringes of villages. We call them Nailevu Koro in Fijian settings. And usually it's only because of suspicion of voodoo, or sometimes it can be the fact that they're no longer functional in the village because of certain limitations to the ability for them to practice out those things, and they're always associated to spirit activity or the wrongs that have been done. But there is no evidence of any of these homes that exist in the fringe of the village in Binikoro just because of somebody who was LGBT. It doesn't exist. That should be the borderline. We are functional people of communal settings. That's it.
Thank you, Rhonda. That's a very strong message, and I hope that that the people who are listening in and who will listen into this recording later share this information to start a bit of conversation within communities. Maria, do you want to add on to that question of identity and our traditional and cultural setting and how it plays into the LGBT identity?
I think Rhonda has pretty much wrapped up some of the underlining details of that, but maybe just from my end very quickly, the tradition and culture and religion are two powerful institutions. And, to carry work within these institutions, they are also sensitive set of work, which we also need to be careful within our methodologies. So I guess one of the ways that the LGBT movement can progress work within this area is to also ensure that we start inviting them into the spaces, first to create awareness and find meaningful ways that we can work together forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Krishneer, remember, you can, if you have any questions, you can send it over to the account, which is arcsuva@state.gov, or to myself, and I'll ask it on your behalf. Or if you wish to ask any questions to our guests, you could use the hands up, raise your hand option. I'll recognize you and we'll give you the mic to ask the question. Krishneer, would you like to contribute to that question?
Yeah, just briefly, I think Rhonda has covered a lot of the important points in terms of being in isolated. This is also common in a lot of the Indo-Fijian settings or in the typical Indian community or settlements. So yeah, we have culture and religion that do play a vital role in terms of the the storyline that's often depicted of the young LGBT person who lives in isolation. They're not able to openly get involved in spaces such as this and be. So oftentimes the support for them is very limited. It's often only when they come into spaces and they identify with other individuals so affirmative action is very important. So it's also very important when we have the opportunities to be involved in the decision-making process, that it is fair and equal. We have equal representative of the individual cross-intersectionality and the identities that are equally present in these spaces. We also have to ensure that people with disabilities and various challenges are also included. We have fair and equal representation. We ensure that our voices are equally heard in the decision-making process to ensure that this is something that we can look into. Thank you.
Abdul, can I just, if I have this time, if I could just quickly add in something which I somehow overlooked in terms of this important conversation. I guess also one of the recommendations as well, and I guess this is one of the moving work too that SIP, the organization that I'm currently in, is working on, because we work very closely with 38 community partners, and these are really grassroots communities, and we not just work with women but also other leaders and village leaders. And I guess one of the work that has been slowly moving in SIP now is that we are now slowly targeting communities, especially their governance structure, where we are slowly introducing the work around inclusivity. And we are working very closely with the community leaders, which is the Turangani Koro, the Maternity Kina, the community nurse and youth leaders, in bringing them to have capacity building around why the work around inclusion is important, and why they also need to start recognizing that there are diverse people in their communities who also need to be sitting in the village meetings or the Amboseva Koros. And these are slowly, entry points that we can start looking into to really start to decentralize human rights and gender justice awareness to really target community levels and slowly find ways that we can shift it. And as I've mentioned before, like there are two powerful institutions, and also one way that we can move this work forward is really start to invite the faith-based organization, the church leaders, and the village leaders into spaces and really try to challenge the narrative and also the need around inclusiveness. Thank you.
Rhonda, you had your hand up. Sorry, if I'm a little bit late in recognizing, it's just because my internet's really slow. All of you are frozen. I'm trying not to play around with my computer as long as I mute and unmute myself. So please go ahead.
It happens, Abdul. The only thing I wanted to add on to the two's participation is just, I think it's also important for us to understand that we as adults and as custodians of the spaces we occupy and the information that we have access to, we can affect these changes. Everything that is religious, I'd like to just have a disclaimer. I honor, I respect that culture and of course religion are two very strong institutions that we need to collaborate with. We as the organization I'm part of as well as Rainbow Pride Foundation, we've had multiple talks with faith-based leaders, and we've actually come to an understanding, a mutual understanding about the importance of forwarding the message of humanity and the importance of talking about things that are good, that exist within pocket-affected populations, including ours. And we've come to that agreement, and I'm so happy that we've reached that understanding. We also need to understand that the practice of culture and its evolution and the change is inevitable. And in order for us to change for the better, we need to be effecting these changes in those spaces. We need to always forward the message that's good. We must always talk about the fact that it is good and it is important for us to continue to participate in these spaces. And then the visible ocular presence of us participating in these spaces allows for those changes, even for religion as well. With all due respect, all of these texts we understand has always been up to interpretation, and it's always an interpretation of its leader that becomes fact. So we must have these conversations with church leaders. We must have this conversation with village leaders, because that's the only way we can actually effect these changes. But we must be present, must be active, must collaborate, as opposed to confrontationalism, in order for these changes to happen. So thank you, Abdul.
Thank you, Rhonda, Maria, and Krishneer. So one of the things that the audience must be able to listen to is that Maria, Rhonda, Krishneer, they're part of different organizations, and they are able to share the success stories. They're able to share important points that they have tried and tested, which can become, best practice for the community in terms of LGBT advocacy. One of the things that I wanted to ask is, I'm a member of the LGBT committee. How do we, the new terms that have entered into the jargons of this activism, which is SOGIS, and we had a little bit of chat last night in our pre-call, and I wanted a little bit of understanding of what does it mean to be LGBT, and what does SOGEISC, I think, SOGIS mean, and this is an information point. So Maria, maybe you would like to start off a little bit on this. What is SOGIS and what is LGBT? Is it the same? Is it different? Can it be used interchangeably? And maybe then Krishneer with Rhonda.
Can you hear me? Okay. Maybe just briefly. LGBT, I guess it talks about the wider LGBT community, but with SOGISC, that is sort of like really unpacking the work to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And thank you, Abdul, for raising this question and also encouraging this conversation, because I guess it's also an important conversation that needs to be progressed within the movement, because I strongly feel that there is still a lot of awareness that needs to be done, not only within the LGBT movement, but also within the broader communities and every other spaces that we work closely with. And I guess some of the unpacking still needs to be done, and how we can link our SOGISC impacts on not only on our everyday life, but also how it affects our identity, how it can be a power and strength for some, and how it can also be a threat for others. And I think it really affects a lot of our social and economic participation. And I guess with the conversation around SOGISC, as much as the awareness is important, I may say that there are a lot of LGBT people that have faced consequences because of their SOGISC, or because of who they are, and because of who they love. And in my work with DIVA, and even until now, we still have people been sharing it in the spaces, in safe spaces, on their pain of how they are discriminated just because of how they present themselves in public, and just because of the fact that they are LGBT people. And maybe just quickly share from the DIVA research report that was shared in 2019. Some of the interesting findings was that 88.8% of LGBT women were kicked out of their homes just because of their sexual preference. Only 2% had mammogram screening, and 10% had pap smear. Only 40% people lack education, and 76.2% who have been sexually assaulted and beaten and do not feel safe anymore to go to the police just because of their SOGISC. And I think this is a very important conversation that does not only require the LGBT movement to move forward. I guess it calls for the wider social movement as well as development partners, state and non-state actors, to really invest more work in progressing SOGI SC work, especially when we all know that for LGBT people, we are already have our rights protected under Section 26 of the Bill of Rights under our Fiji Constitution. And there's still a need and a call out for our policy leaders to ensure that they're implementing laws and also ensuring that our rights are recognized and are protected. And as much as we are there in the Constitution, I guess the challenge at the moment is still around the implementations of laws and ensuring that our rights are protected. And also in terms of implementation, it needs to be happening on the ground, and also ensuring that we are aligning back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.
Okay, Krishneer put his thumbs up. I just wanted to add on, while either Krishneer or Rhonda, if you wish to answer this question, is like, how do we unpack SOGIS and SOGI SC? I keep on saying SOGIS, SOGI and SOGI SC and LGBT, and the differences and the similarities within the movement first, because within the movement, there are lots of people who are part of the struggle, you know, to be recognized, to be accepted. So how do we unpack this for the movement?
I've also been realizing through social media that there are frustrations that also exist with our inability to understand SOGIESC and LGBT. If you look at SOGIESC, maybe before I go into that, I think it's also important for us to understand the difference between sex and gender. We'll start off with sex. Sex is basically referring to biological traits that determine whether we fit into one of the two binaries, whether we're male or female. Gender, on the other hand, within our community is more related to the roles that we play and how do we express those roles externally. Gender is, I can be born biologically male, but I express myself to be a woman. That's an example, which makes me a trans woman under that. So SOGIESC is a clear determinant or definer for the LGBTIQ. If you look at LGB is the sexual orientation aspect of SOGIESC. TQ would then be the gender identity aspect of SOGIESC, while intersex, I at the end, refers to then the sexual characteristics, which is the ending part of SOGIESC. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there are people who refuse to be defined by this. We must respect it. People are allowed to make their own choices. I think it's also important for us to understand why it's important for us to know who we are in another spectrum. So SOGIESC allows you to understand LGBT a little bit more. But at the end of the day, it's not a tool that we should be using against each other, depending on the different labels that we've been tagged with, because that is something that also exists within the community. There are conflicts, I'll speak very frankly, there are conflicts that exist between trans women and of course gay men. Again, I feel like it's birthed from the misunderstanding. There are conflicts that exist between bisexual people and lesbians, for example. Again, it's all birthed from misunderstanding, and I feel like one of the best things I can give away to us right now is due diligence. It's high time that we keep ourselves informed, so we are above all of this negativity and these conversations that only exist to create more barriers between us. You know, there are also conversations about how this discourse about that exists between the different labels are brought upon us because of the society's attempt at trying to understand us. But then again, we must not allow that to dictate how we identify ourselves. It's very important for anyone who's listening in, and I think it's also important for our allies who are also here to understand that it's important to know who we are and that we are no different, but this is what society looks at us as, and just to help them understand of the kind of people that we are. But other than that, we're not meant to be discoursing identities. We're not meant to be using this as excuses to why my voice should be heard a little bit more than the other. All our voices need to be heard. We all need to be having seats at the table. So GS is important. Look it up. So you know who you are, so you can have pride.
Mhm.
It's Pride Month after all. Have pride in your identity. I hope that helped.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Because my screen is frozen. Would Krishneer like to share anything on this? I will go by the voice, yes or no, from the interpreter. Sorry, my screen's really frozen.
Yeah, I'll share a bit. And I agree with Maria and Rhonda, and they have captured my points of view as well too. So this expression of one's self, for instance, in my community, I have a lot of friends. So we have these deaf women who identify themselves as men, but people see them, okay, that person is a lesbian, but no, that person can be a straight person. But it's how they express themselves and how they are comfortable with themselves. So it's how we see that it's part of Sojiask and their involvement and how they see themselves and how they're comfortable. But it can be a real struggle as well. So I think a good thing we need to have is more allies. We need to look at champions or people whom we can work together with in the community to make more awareness and to be able to change mindsets to positive thinking and perspectives. So also RPF, they have wonderful programs, and also they could be invited to make speeches and do awareness work in some programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. And that brings me to the other part of the third objective of our webinar, which is talking a little bit about LGBT organizations and movements. So maybe I would open this floor to any of the speakers if they wish to. A little bit of background on how the LGBT movement gained grounds in Fiji. I understand that the 2013 constitution allowed for no discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender, and other identities. But I also understand that movements already existed. I think the first one that I remember is something to do with the USP. USP had a LGBT movement, but then I was very small, so I just heard it, but I did not know it at that time. I was still sexually confused.
I think.
Yeah.
Yes, Trondrolangi movement. Yes.
Yep.
So maybe if the speakers would like to contribute a little bit towards the history of the movements and organizations that have come up to the point we are at now, and a little bit of what the priorities now are, so that the listeners could understand where they could support and be allies for the movement. So let's start with Maria, and then we'll go to Rhonda, and then we'll go to Krishna. We're going backwards on the screen now.
Yes, thank you, Abdul. Maybe I'll just speak of my experience when I joined the movement. I, in fact, came sort of late into the movement work, which was in 2015, because I came from corporate background. And maybe from my experience working with Diva and other sets of work that I was in, there are moving work on LGBT. But from my experience, there's still a lot of organizations and affiliations and networks that are still working in silos, and I guess that is something that perhaps has been a challenge, and we are still trying to work towards finding ways that we can address this situation around working in silos. And perhaps from my end, I may just would like to speak more on in terms of progressing the work within the movement. I just hope to speak a little bit more around, because I think one of the objectives is around allyship. So from my end, I just would like to input on what it means to work in solidarity and in allyship within the LGBT movement. And I may speak of my experience in DIVA, was that there have been organizations and networks that have been working together. But I guess the challenge is there still need to be more unpacking of an understanding of the word solidarity, working in solidarity, and working to be allies to one another. And one of the terms that they use a lot in DIVA, which is accompaniment, which I feel has a much more relevance if we really want to work in solidarity. And I guess this is one of the challenge, because if we want to say that we are allies to one another within the LGBT movement, we know that our issues are the same, regardless if you're L or G or B or T or Q and I. Our issues of this is almost the same, and we are one of the frontline communities in terms of the societal injustices that we are going through. And I guess that means that it needs to translate into the solidarity work that we do. I guess if we want to say that you're an ally, you need to really mean it and work meaningfully around being an ally to one another. And that also includes that when we are in spaces that we represent each other, even though if you are there or if you're not there, if disability or sex workers are in the room, that we should represent each other, regardless of who is present in the room. And I think if we want to also be genuine in our solidarity work, we need to find ways to negotiate powers, and also, placing our egos on the side, which is one of the challenge that sometimes we overlook, and find ways to call each other assertively, because sometimes we tiptoe around each other when it comes to certain issues, and we really don't address that. And I guess these are some of the work that we need to really mean it when we say we work in solidarity. And perhaps in terms of the movement building as well, I would like to quickly pick up as well that we need to also start recognizing some of the leadership structures that we have in the LGBT community is becoming gatekeepers to the work and moving forward key works that we need in our LGBT work, not only in Fiji, but also in the region. And this can be dangerous to the movement work because it starts to create toxic spaces, and people cannot thrive in those communities. And this has also led to push some human rights and also LGBT defenders out of the movement work. And maybe I just would like to leave with a message that, again, we also have to align ourselves to the work that we do. Let's be driven by passion and not be distracted by other materialistic benefits that the work brings to the table. And I guess these are some uncomfortable discussion that has been there, but it needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And I think that's a very important point, that while we are advocating outside to external parties or stakeholders, we need to have these hard conversations with ourselves. And it's very relevant discussion within our movement also. And it's not I don't think that it's a back and forth of stuff, but it's more let's come to an understanding that we are moving ahead together and everybody's moving ahead with us. So thank you so much for that. Rhonda, a little bit of maybe history of the LGBT movement in Fiji or the Pacific, and the priorities that we have now with the different organizations that exist to further the struggle for the LGBT people.
From my knowledge, my goodness, I only wish I had all of the information in front of me. But when I came into the movement in 2005, I believe, my understanding was that there were organizations or networks of people, LGBT people, that were already working towards pushing for reform, legislative reform, policy reflections, etc. I pay tribute to people like Peter Sipeli, who was already there in the movement a long while back, in Nambulivo. I also named Isikeli Bulobo. These were people that were already paving the way for us during its toughest times, pre-2000, going into early 2000. And then when I came in, and then it was, of course, during that time, a lot of focus of funding and the budget allocations from our different stakeholders was driven towards HIV and all of that through UNAIDS, etc. So there was a boom. There was a boom then with the LGBT movement of organizations all came out, and then we used and accessed those fundings to further the message of why it's important to have people participate in spaces. Up until when we had the unfortunate review of the Constitution. I'm sure we all remember the Yashgai Constitution. That was a very interesting time. I believe Maria and I, along with Miki, the director for House of Chameleon, we collaborated on a proposal that we put forward on an amendment to a constitutional clause, which I'm thankful, even though the Ashgai Constitution did not see the light of day, it saw it being reflected in Section 26 of our Bill of Rights in our current Constitution. Right after that, the movement got stronger. The voices were seemingly louder. We were now heard, and now we were holding institutions accountable to absorbing this certain aspect of our law. I started with Men Fiji back in 2005. I was one of its pioneer, lucky pioneers that got training in SOGIESC and LGBT. Of course, it was geared more towards HIV awareness, etc. And then Men Fiji then eventually evolved into Rainbow Pride Foundation, which was registered as a company limited by guarantee. Because unfortunately, in our movement, registration of organizations under the Charitable Trust Act hasn't come easy. So Rainbow Pride Foundation in their own spaces decided to be smart with the system. So we registered our organization as a company limited by guarantee. And the legislative work continues until date. And the partnerships, I also acknowledge that DIVA was also in existence right then from the get-go as well. I remember moments we've collaborated for the sake of the LBT movement, and also with Chris Prasad, who founded the Rhonda movement in the university. I remember that as well. I was in university. I'm sure Abdul must have been a baby back then, but these are people who I'm happy to pay due credit to because of the good work that they've been doing. Through those collaborations, I was glad enough to have met Maria and make a constitutional review submission, which I say out of the many submissions, along with ours, it was effective enough to make that change into Section 26 of our Bill of Rights. And then we, I think it was around 2010 or 11, Fiji was lucky to have hosted the Free and Equal campaign by the United Nations. And that, again, was a substantive move from our side as a country, being the only country in the Pacific that has it recognized in our constitution. So yes, the movement is here and it continues to go on. There has been a struggle because of the shift of funding from HIV and AIDS, which we took advantage of, and it's now towards climate change. We have now tried to be smarter by contextualizing our advocacy, hence why intersectional conversations are now important for us, because that's our point of entry. And here we are now. I think our work is not done. It's important that the reflection of these laws needs to start trickling down into policy. My bread and butter is paid for because of my work in a corporate space, and I still see limitations exist, even though the Constitution protects us according to our gender identity or sexual orientation. So that needs to start trickling down, and it's the people at the helm who dictate how they control their spaces. They need to start seeing things. They need to start seeing things like it's supposed to be. Humanity should be a top priority. I'll probably end with a favorite saying that I'm always inspired by from Dr. Maya Angelou: perspective is everything, reality is nothing. Change your perspectives, influence changes in those spaces, and continue to be the catalyst to a better Fiji. So yes, I also want to talk about how there are so many victims and lives that we have lost due to the continuous attempt of trying to be recognized in our spaces and living in our authenticity. We've lost quite a few people due to gender-based violence and transphobia. It is things like that that continue to fuel the work that we do. We will continue to do so until we see some good change. So yeah, thank you, Abdul.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Thank you, Rhonda. And I just wanted to point something out that you said that I think is very important, which was that along with the 2013 Constitution, the voices of the LGBT community kind of got elevated because they had those provisions in the legal framework. And that, for me, that goes on to show that political will is very important for the movement. We can be part of the movement, we can be lobbying, but there needs to be allyship from those who are in power, who can make changes to our constitutional frameworks to allow the recognition, the acceptance, and provide for workplaces or environment where people of different diversities can thrive. So that's one of the things that I'm taking away from what you and Maria have said. I'm going to turn to Krishneer, and this will we'll probably be coming to an end in the next 5 minutes because we are reaching the 1.5 hour mark. Krishneer, what would you like to talk about the LGBT movement within maybe the people living with disability community, the recognition, the work that you're doing, and what are your priorities right now in 2021?
Abdul, sorry, no, I don't have anything further to add. I think they've both really beautifully covered a lot of the topics I had wanted to cover. So thank you very much.
Okay, that's good. We are coming to the end because we said we'll try to keep it within 1.5 hours, but there's so many questions that we had discussed in our pre-call and with our council. Some of our council members had sent some questions in. We haven't covered, for example, art. We haven't covered COVID. We haven't covered climate change, mental health, health in general. But as I said, this is just webinar 1 of 4, and these topics are going to come in our next webinars with a new set of guests. And we're going to take a bit more regional focus in line with the accreditation of the US Embassy in Suva. So we might see Tonga and Kiribati and other countries joining in our colleagues from that side, maybe. So before we end, I'm going to allow the floor to our 3 speakers, maybe to give a quick 2 or 3 minutes ending remark. And Maria, would you want to go for this one first?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Abdul. Maybe just very quickly. Maybe I just would like to take this time to recognize all the amazing work the LGBT movement, the feminist movement have been doing on human rights and LGBT rights. And also would like to take this time as well to acknowledge all the women and human rights defenders before us who have put their bodies on the line so that we can be able to move this work. And it's a very critical work. Even though we lack the resources and support, we need to acknowledge the courage that we have. And that's why I would like to acknowledge my 2 colleagues. And I know that also part of the objective behind this is I know that a lot of youths are watching. Maybe just a quick message to them is that we are at a critical time, especially with the climate crisis as well as COVID, which is directly threatening our livelihood and survival of humankind, as well as the planet and all the living beings. I just would like to challenge you to take personal challenge, educate yourself on all issues, utilize the power of social media, not only to learn, but also to use it for advocacy. Don't be afraid to speak truth to power and ensure that information and knowledge that you have is shared to make a change in people's lives and in situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Rhonda?
Yes, a big thank you, Vinaka to the facilitators for this session and of course the invitation. I'm of course very humbled to have been invited and of course share my thoughts. I like the Talanoa spaces. I'm always for the spirit of learning and of course development within our own people. I'm also thankful that I forgot to allude to a success story. Um, we have now 2 regional bodies that have been birthed since Free and Equal, and that has been PSGDN, that's Pacific Section Gender Diversity Network, and of course ILGA Oceania, which now allows our voices to be heard in regional spaces, and of course in international spaces, which have already been penetrated by so many of our movement leaders before us. Also, a success story is PSGDN's receiving ECOSOC recognition with the United Nations. So that's a success story for us here, especially us in the Pacific, as PSGDN's headquarters is based here in Suva. Other than that, I'm still thankful to the people who have come on, willing to listen to our stories. I know they can get a little bit expansive and of course, very information laden. But I'm so thankful for all your patience, and I'm looking forward to the change that this will affect on all of your lives. So thank you so much, Abdul.
Thank you, Rhonda. Krishneer.
Yes, I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank all the facilitators, the moderator for also the American Youth Council, the Embassy's Youth Council that actually organized this and having us contribute and share our stories and experiences and just being able to share with you some of the challenges that we constantly go through and everything. It's quite an informative and very in-depth session. We're hoping that the next few will be a bit more inclusive, to have the participation of other young people with disabilities also participate in this platform. This is a great opportunity where we can just have a very informal Talanoa session, share our stories, and just talk about issues that concern us on a daily basis. Yep, so yeah, just briefly, my closing remarks are, we're not really asking for same-sex marriage or anything, or we're just asking for equal recognition and safe spaces and just being able to be involved in society and have spaces that we can freely express ourselves and our and who we are. So nothing about us without us. That's my closing remark. I leave you all with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishneer. Nothing nothing about us without us. So very important, and really important to recognize that the priorities of the community, you need to know it from the community members themselves and not from what you hear from those who are not part of the community or on social media. Same-sex marriage has been floated around a lot in Fiji, but that is not the priority of the community. The priority, as Krishneer has mentioned, is recognition, acceptance, and equality for themselves at the very base, because we are all human beings. And I think that's a very good note to end this conversation with. Thank you, Krishneer. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Maria, from the Embassy, US Embassy Youth Council, and the US Embassy who have partnered with us on this. Thank you to the audience who have joined us. Some of you have sent me questions. Talay, who has been our embassy mother, I would say, for the Youth Council, helping us out, taking time out on the weekends to join us for the calls. Becca's leaving the embassy. She's one of the individuals who was involved in getting the US Embassy Youth Council off the ground. It is giving us this opportunity to actually host this call. So thank you so much, Becca, and good luck with wherever you're going to be. That actually brings us to the end of our conversation. Does Becca or Talay want to have anything to say before we end the recording? And yeah.
Hi. My daughter was telling me a funny story. Anyway, I'm so really grateful for this wonderful opportunity. I love that the Youth Council has come up with this great idea for Talanoas on a variety of subjects. And this is a really wonderful one for Pride Month. So we are very excited to hear more from you and for the rest of the month, for the rest of these series. So thank you, Youth Council, and thank you to our speakers who shared really wonderful things about how we can be better allies, how we can work together to promote human rights. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Naka.
Great. And remember, we'll be having more webinars for this whole month. We have 3 more that we are thinking of doing, 1 per week. So just keep an eye out on our social media pages. We'll try to make the registrations easier this time. I have realized we wanted to keep the security a little bit tight, but we'll try to work around that for our next webinar. So thank you so much. See you guys
Naka
next time.
Abdul.